Yeah, so I'm Val Troll. I am a petrologist by training, and I specialized in igneous rocks and everything to do with igneous rocks, resources, so volcanic resources, volcanic hazards, volcanic processes in the wider sense. And I've been working in the field for, well, over 20 years now. So, and I've published on exactly these things: volcanic resources, processes, hazards, and also a little bit on hazard mitigation. And my interest is really kind of rather broad. Everything to do with volcanoes is in some way of interest to me. So that's me. I work here in Uppsala University, and I'm here for a little over 10 years now. And I have worked in various kind of areas: Indonesia, the Canary Islands, Italy, Iceland, and originally I worked in old volcanic provinces like the British Irish Tertiary Igneous Province, and from there I expanded into more kind of active systems. So that's I guess enough about me to get you going.
Yeah, no, that's good. So yeah, I'll just kind of run through briefly my research so far, and then we can sort of get on to it.
Yep.
So yeah, just looking at UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and specifically in small island states, and looking at how if they have risk management plans in place for natural hazards and things to protect their sites, and then looking at how, if at all, they use traditional knowledge as part of that. But lots of them don't even have risk management, disaster management strategies at all. So that's kind of where I've been looking a bit more specifically in terms of the kind of community engagement between like these risk sites and hazards, and if there's maybe a missing link between sort of traditional science and this local knowledge, which is kind of why when I read your paper about the oral traditions at Merapi, and how maybe there's a sense sometimes that we don't take these folklore stories seriously necessarily, when actually they could teach us quite a lot about things that we don't know or haven't proven yet.
I agree with that. I would broadly agree with that, although I'm not a specialist for small island states,
no, sure.
things like that. But I'm in agreement that many of these legends and myth, they have some valid information, some kernel of truth in there, and it's our job to kind of identify what we can learn from them. I personally would argue there's a reason why they exist. I mean, nobody tells just stories to entertain people. That these stories will go away very quickly. So the ones that stay, that they have some deeper meaning and message, and I think that's what you are after here.
Yeah, sure. And I guess just, you mentioned that you've worked in different places like Indonesia, Iceland, places like that. Those are places that I think have very strong sort of mythologies and traditions. I just wonder if, when you've been working there, if you noticed that there was a lot of sort of maybe hazard related stories from the people there, or if there was a connection between the people and the landscapes and the volcanoes there.
You mean in Iceland specifically, or in a wider context?
In a kind of in any of the places you've been, if you've noticed that that's...
It's interesting. Maybe you have time. I had a chat with Tordas on well, 1.5 years ago. It was one of these little interviews we did in the car to the airport, and we talked about Katla volcano and things like that. And Tor was giving me a breakdown of some of the legends. I mean, in Iceland, they're about 1,000 years old maximum, because that's the settlement period. But there, for example, there's this belief that there's a witch living inside Katla, and I guess Katla is one of these volcanoes. It's a little temperamental, and it's a little unpredictable. And so a certain character has been assigned to the volcano, in the sense that a certain type of of a person, well, a witch, I don't know, is it a person? Anyway, sort of some mythical creature is associated with it, somewhere from a slightly different world, and it gives this volcano a description of a character that we can kind of relate to. And I think it's a hazard message, of course. It tells you that this volcano can be unpredictable, temperamental even, and might have something up its sleeve that you didn't think about. It can have even a magic spell that you weren't thinking about. And back in the days prior to volcanology being a real science, I think getting this message across in simple terms is very important. And this is also what people are finding in Indonesia now. A few years ago, I came across this ancient legend, and I was very intrigued. And while checking it out, I realized that geological features and legends seem to link up in a strange way. And details aside, some of these concepts have now been used in school education around Merapi, and it does seem to have an impact. Those schools that use the ancient legends, they seem to have better results. The students have better results in terms of hazard preparedness and things like that. So I personally think it makes sense if you grow up with some of these legends. As a kid, it allows you to grasp more quickly what the dangers might be without having to understand the science. So it's, if you will, in my view, it's a form of it's a simplified language. It's like a picture language almost, and it's images that are used, and not so much the actual science. I mean, if I tell you, oh, the seismicity has increased to factor blah blah, or the demon inside Merapi is on the move, then I guess the latter is more impactful. And in a situation where quick measures like evacuation are needed, this might just make a huge difference when you communicate to local communities.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really important point. I was speaking to somebody yesterday who works in Bermuda, and she was saying kind of similar to what you're saying about, maybe it's instead of coming in with the scientific language that people have no maybe connection to or understanding of, but there's specific kind of, if you kind of just appear with a plan, it can come over, obviously with the history there, kind of another form of colonialism-esque. You're inputting something from somewhere else into this area without engaging with the community as to actually what do you do when a disaster strikes? What have your families done? It's this kind of one size fits all hazard.
I would agree with you. I mean, it's a delicate topic, because sometimes if on the basis of real data, someone like an authority figure might actually know better, it's it can be also counterproductive to be too much against that just because the language isn't chosen perfectly or so. On the other side, if you don't reach the people concerned, then you have a problem. So, and then it's the radio station that needs to think about the language it's using rather than the people on the other side, because they can just switch off, and that's your problem. So irrespective of justification, you need to find a language that is highly efficient, particularly in stressful hazard situations where risk is very high. And one of the problems, certainly in Indonesia, is that there's, of course, different religious leanings. And the majority in Java, certainly around Merapi, is Muslim. But then there's smaller communities that are Hindu, and there is sometimes issues there because one group doesn't want to believe in ancient myth and devils inside volcanoes. This is considered blasphemy by one group, while for the others, this is very normal to think about a whole pantheon of different deities. For them, this is very normal language. But then there's people who live in between, a bit like when you think of the Vikings here in Sweden. There was this transition period where they had crosses on rune stones tones. So, you know, there is people who are listening to all sides. So you can have different, you can hold different beliefs at the same time. I discussed it a little bit in a 2015 article. I mean, I'm not a specialist on it, but I found it fascinating. So you will reach more people this way, but I've also seen that some people get very upset. But you have to potentially choose your language according to the settlement or village you are dealing with, depending on their cultural background. So this has to be almost fine-tuned, I would say, in order to get the maximum effect.
And do you think that science or scientists have caught up with that enough? Do you think it's still a developing thing that people are fine-tuning their language to suit where they are? Do you think that's still a growing sort of?
I think it's a growing thing. And in this 2021 Geology Today article, which I think I sent you, at the very end, I'm summarizing some results from these tests they did in, I think it was primary schools in Indonesia. And they only did it in 3 schools around the volcano as a test project. And there the results were up to 20% improvement in the hazard preparedness results. So it shows that this is promising, but if it's not done on a wide scale, if the government in Indonesia, which is Muslim oriented, because that's the majority, if they're not catching fully on to this, if there's resistance within the educational sector there, then this might not go as far as it could. And you know, it's not for me to judge. I mean, it's their kind of situation. They need to kind of make these decisions. But I could see that certainly when you talk with youngsters, which are extremely vulnerable in these situations, you might need to refine your language. And whether you believe in myth and demons and goddesses and things is or not is a different issue. It's about that. You know, when I explain something to my 5-year-old, I use a different language than when I talk with you, for instance, obviously. So this is maybe something we need to consider here.
Sure. And I guess that seems to me like a key place to start with these discussions is in like schools, education, because that's the generation now, especially, that's going to be dealing with a lot of issues around hazards and climate change, all these sorts of things. And
absolutely. And I personally am a big fan of using these myths and legends as a starting point. You can always add that when in the legend there's rumbling and it's believed to be that some deity is on the move or so, then of course you can explain afterwards, well, these are actually earthquakes, and this river along which this deity is moving is actually there because there's a geological fault underneath, and things like that. So I have no issue with putting this in context so that the kids can actually see that these legends are just a quick, simple way to communicate issues, and that scientific rationale is usually found behind them, that there is a reason for that. So this is not to kind of keep people ignorant of science. That would be wrong. But to get the message across, sometimes these other forms are very efficient. So
no, and yeah, I think you're right. And you know, stories are such a big part of childhood anyway. So why not make them kind of an educational tool and help understanding? I think that it can't be a bad thing for sure to
absolutely. I fully agree. I think well, and if it's about saving lives, let's face it, then the ends justify the means. I think so, at least.
No, I agree. I think I think, especially like you say, you know, you go and tell a 5-year-old child about seismic activity, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything to a lot of adults as well. So
that's exactly the point. Yes.
So I think like a lot of what I've been looking at is just like the kind of maybe an engagement with the communities that's just been missing from a lot of in this case it would be like disaster management mitigation scenarios, and that kind of, to me, goes both ways. Maybe they're not being people are communicating with the communities enough about what is happening, but equally they're not listening enough to communities to learn what, like we were saying, the history of places. If you just go in and go, oh, this is what's happening, you're not listening to what's been happening for hundreds of years. I think that's a missed step in a lot of places.
I agree with you. However, to be fair, it's quite an effort, you know. You almost need to think about extra personnel, communication, trained communication personnel, people who are really good at this, because the guy who watches the seismometer is not strictly the person to communicate these things to the population.
Sure.
We are putting a lot of pressure on the scientists here, because let's face it, I mean, when I think of what I do, I need to be good with rocks, I need to be good with maps, I need to be good with people, I need to be good with languages, I need to be good with organizing travel, I need to be good with machines, and there comes a point where none of us is perfect with everything. Sure. So I think that the USGS does that, for instance. They have communication people, they go out to the communities and say, now Mount St. Helens is waking up again, you better leave. And even then you have these legends of people who say, no, I won't leave.
Of course, yeah.
So, and if you think about communities, traditional communities, it's potentially double as hard, because even if there is a communication specialist, if that's a very kind of closed community in terms of its culture and experience, an outsider might not be listened to in the same way. And at Merapi, there was this weird situation. There was this guardian of the volcano, a very old man who lived in a little village close to the volcano summit. And you know, again, it's not for me to judge this person's actions, but the person was arguing that the volcano is a friend and that the volcano will not harm them. And he encouraged people to stay in the villages on the volcano slopes. And then, of course, he perished in a volcanic eruption. So while on the one side, some of these traditional or let's call it traditional ways of thinking may be useful, in other times they may also be misguided. And this is where ancient legends, I think, are almost more reliable, because they had a test period. If they were not useful, they would have been forgotten very quickly. So if you have, for example, a group of elderlies or so, wise people in a village, they may or may not be right. That's the problem here. So, and this case at Merapi was actually desperately wrong. And there was another case in Bali, 1963, at the Big Agung eruption. I don't know whether you heard about that, but there was actually a procession of people moving up towards the lava flow with musical instruments and things like that. And actually a fair number of them died. And there's this weird, bizarre images of musical instruments in lava and things like that. And they were ill-advised, obviously, and they were relying on local traditions, but they were not necessarily tested local traditions, not very old ones, but there was a belief that there's goodness in the volcano and the volcano will spare them. So this can also go badly wrong, actually, and this is where care needs to be taken. So as a communication tool to get people to move away, I think it's useful. But if it goes the other way, if the traditions encourage you to go closer to an erupting volcano, I would think twice, you know.
Sure. Okay. So you kind of have to go in without, not a blind faith that.
That's right, exactly. I mean, these things are not just, you know, they're not, they have to be taken with a pinch of salt, let's put it like that.
I think what you said before as well was interesting about, you know, that while these things are useful, there's not always the manpower or the because when I was speaking to the woman from Bermuda, you know, the point she made a lot was that they just don't have the capacity in a lot of these places to be able to do it, whether that be funding or you know, the knowledge of people within that area. And yeah, and another person I spoke to, they were, I mean, it was kind of slightly different, but just talking about getting their UNESCO site onto the official list. Somewhere in America could pay $1 million to make a fancy presentation, and if you're Vanuatu or Fiji or so if that's what you can spend to come up with a glossy kind of magazine, effectively you're going to be able to spend more in terms of communicating.
Well, this is one of these bizarre things. I mean, we live in a somewhat bizarre time and world. I guess you know that. I know that. We have to make the best of it. Some things are not strictly balanced, for good or bad. Again, it's not for me to judge. It's just observing it.
Yeah.
And I mean, indeed, if you think of some Asian countries, there's all sorts of issues. Again, it's not for me to judge, but I mean, thinking of places like Indonesia, there is rebels in Timor, there's rebels in Aceh, there is disputed oil fields and the borders with Malaysia. The Navy is kind of always busy with protecting the oil fields. Then there is HIV problems, and now there's Corona problems, and there is, well, to be fair, the poverty level has been changed a lot. I mean, poverty has been generally decreasing a lot, but I mean, there's still a higher poverty level than with us. So a larger percentage of the population lives in poverty there.
Yeah.
So less people have internet access. It's tricky. So, and you as a decision maker, you will have to kind of put these things in context. What is really important? How many people will, how many fatalities are you expecting from volcanic eruptions? And how many are you getting from other problems that you're not attending to? And where do you put the money then? So, and then of course, there's political decisions to be made. If there's a catastrophe in one end of the country, then the rebels in the other end of the country might seize their chance, So, and these are extremely difficult decisions. I had a little, also it's on YouTube if you're interested. I had a little chat with somebody from Mexico, Klaus Siebert, and it's about legends around Popocatepetl. And he discusses some of these problems with me in that interview. He also talks about some of the legends, the old Aztec legends in the region, which seem to imply that there was a rhythmicity to the eruptive record of the volcano. And this seems to link with archaeological things. But that person also kind of mentions that for politicians it's extremely difficult because there's loads of other problems. Certainly in a large place like Mexico City. Volcanoes are small problems sometimes, So.
Yeah, and if the perceived risk is, well, it might not happen, so why would we waste our money on something that may not happen during the time we're elected? Because, I mean, without,
That's another
kind of
thing.
Politicians just think in sort of 4 or 5 year, increments, so.
Sadly so. I mean, I'm not in the slightest saying we should all become monarchies again. I mean, at least there you had people who were interested in a longer spell potentially. So I can see advantages to that. So I think, you're absolutely right. I mean, we all think in terms of, certain episodes. I mean, let's face it, I think in terms of grants that I get. The grant is active for 4 years. I have to deliver certain goals within that time frame. That's what I will try to do. So, and then you sometimes go, well, can't deal with this now, although there may be great potential for exploring something, but it might fall by the wayside just because I have a report deadline, so things like that. So I understand politicians, don't misunderstand me. But is it the best way of doing it? I don't know.
Yeah, sure. I guess that's another sort of ticking the box of these sort of local legends and things. They have been around. Well, like you say, there's limits to it, but a lot of them have met the test of time in terms of, like you said, if they were wrong, they wouldn't necessarily have lasted that long,
Yes.
and so there is some degree of faith, or that you can put into that.
I think so, particularly the older ones. As I said, if they're very recent kind of phenomena, you have to be a little careful potentially. Sure. But I mean, very simple. I mentioned Popocatepetl. There's Popocatepetl and Ixtaccíhuatl, the two volcanoes side by side, a little bit outside Mexico City, 50, 60 kilometers or so away. And the legend is about this warrior and the princess, and it's a bit of this Romeo and Juliet story, and Juliet basically dies, Ixtaccíhuatl that is, and so she's a lying kind of lady in the local mythology, and Popocatepetl is an angry warrior, and indeed Popocatepetl is the active volcanoes that has these CO2 bursts, these blowouts, and Ixtaccíhuatl hasn't erupted in any historical kind of time. So these simple things give you a very clear indication. One is a sleeping volcanic edifice, the other one is an angry volcanic edifice. And so it tells you a lot, it gives you a lot of information actually. So.
And I can imagine, especially in places where there's not been a lot of necessarily maybe written history of these things, that you have to rely on the oral histories, because that's all you have, and you can't just ignore it because it's not written down. That doesn't necessarily make it any less valid.
Yes, actually, I think this is interesting. In this 2015 article, this was a bit of a mind dump for me. It's a very long article, but so all my weird thoughts have gone in there. But I read a little bit in the field of game theory, and you can find these papers yourself. The people are doing experiments. If there's a small group of people involved, knowledge gets lost very quickly. And if there's a large group of people, knowledge is added in layers. So the myths are getting more and more complicated, and they're getting more colorful. So it's going to be harder to find the truth in the whole thing. But if you have small groups, then knowledge loss is a real problem. So you almost need to simplify the stories to a point that they're still meaningful. And I guess when you can talk in a language that has to do with certain superheroes and deities and that kind of thing, we all love superheroes, and then it's much easier to communicate. You don't have to write it down. You can keep it within a small community, and even knowledge loss on details can be partly compensated for by keeping the gist of the story in a simple kind of arrangement. So this is what I think is sometimes very important, that the size of the community makes a difference. And some of the stories have, by the nature of the community, gone simpler, and they have been broken down into very rudimentary concepts.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. It's not something I'd really sort of thought of before, that the size of community would have such a potentially such a difference on
I was quite surprised about that myself, and if you're interested, I remember that I wrote a few lines about this in this 2015 article, and there's a few references to some studies. There was even, I think, a Nature paper by game theory people, mathematicians, and so on, that did test there. I mean, it's obviously not my speciality, but I found it intriguing that some of these legends in Indonesia, for example, they have multiple layers. They're very complicated. They originate in pre-Buddhist time and pre-Hindu time. There's some animistic kind of concepts in these legends, and then they have gone through Hindu and Buddhist filters, and then eventually they have gone through Islamic filters, culturally speaking. So they have survived multiple changes of religion, and that is a good sign that there is something truthful about it and meaningful about it, and that I think is very important.
Sure, because I mean, I think it goes against. No, it goes against religion, but it would be easy for one religion to dismiss and other
Absolutely.
stories because
Oh,
it's
they have a tendency to do that.
yeah. Yeah, I was trying to find a delicate way to say it, but yeah, no, yeah, I think so. Yeah, like you say, it must be a good sign when that survived that all those different influences and remains more or less the same sort of rudimentary story.
Yes.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that's been great. Actually, I really appreciate those stories. I don't think there's anything else that I can think of to ask you, but yeah, that's been really interesting just to hear a bit more about that. It's been great.
My pleasure, David. No props at all. Let's see kind of how you fare, and let me know if you want to kind of chat any more about any of this, and make use of these things I mentioned if you like. So you can also send me an email, and I can try to guide you if you're struggling finding something. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your write-up then, and I wish you all the very best for your work.
Thank you very much.